Let's get cracking, since we have a packed agenda, as always, with the key learnings from the data. So what have we as net impact nerds, if that is a term that I can use to refer to us here at the Upright office, learned putting our heads in the EU regulatory data for a change? The topic and overall theme is very similar to net impact. We're obviously talking about the impact of companies, but EU's approach is a bit different. So what have we learned? The first highlight that we would like to make for all of you is that please bear in mind, whenever you're using the EU taxonomy data, that it leaves out quite many highly impactful companies. Someone might even say that the vast majority, depending a little bit on what you're looking at. And now, let's of course remember, we are only talking about the two first objectives that are now completely clarified by the EU of how they should be quantified, and that we have been quantifying the whole autumn. So this is now the climate change adaptation and mitigation lens. But still, let's look at concrete figures, because we talked about a lot about, is the taxonomy good? Is the SFDR good or bad? What I'm really excited about is that now we have concrete data of thousands of companies, their exact data points. So we can also look a little bit into like statistics. So let's look at what does this look like? This is just a couple of groups that we looked at. We looked at for what percentage of companies inside certain groups or indexes of companies the eligibility percentage is 0, meaning that these will not even be will not even be explored in more detail. So obviously then the alignment percentages are way lower than the eligibility. But even the eligibility, which then of course rules out the rest of the investment space if you are using this as a way to screen, are pretty high. So for your more like generalistic groups like Eurostoxx 50, S&P Europe 350, or maybe the FTSE 100, they are somewhere around 40 to 50%. Now this means that essentially the message is that about more than half of the companies in FTSE 100 are not impacting climate change according to the EU taxonomy. Okay, and if you look at a little bit less established groups, for example, you might one of our great communities that we work with here in Helsinki is the Maria 01 Startup Hub that is also run and supported by the city of Helsinki. From their startups, a whopping 81% of the companies account as 0% eligible to be even explored more for the first two taxonomy objectives. And if you look at then something traditionally impact nice, but not necessarily climate-wise, like a Fidelity MSCI healthcare index, 90% are totally like disregarded by the first two objectives. And you might be thinking like, okay, well, health, that's not really something in climate change. But in today's atmosphere, I would say that every single company has some kind of an impact on climate change. And that probably should be taken into account in some way. And this is not only refer to new innovative tech companies or health companies, which might be a bit more understandable. But this one example that really caught my attention was also in recycled carton board, or more generically or more broadly speaking, the different kinds of substitutes for plastic. For example, wood-based substitutes for plastic, which you might even in the more traditional mainstream discussion see as something being relevant to climate change. At least they are being heavily marketed and even scientifically studied for their climate impact. This is now an example for Mayr-Melnhof, a great Austrian company. Some similar companies might be found also here in the Nordics, like Huhtamäki, for example, in Finland. But anyways, let's now look at Mayr-Melnhof. Their total eligibility is 0.0%. So both for the climate change adaptation and mitigation, according to the EU taxonomy. However, when we have a look at the actual impact, now we're also highlighting their net impact profile. For example, looking at their scientifically proven impacts in the environment category. For example, for greenhouse gas emissions and waste, you might argue that they are not really non-impactful for climate, at least. So this is something to keep in mind when looking at the taxonomy percentages for the data. What are the implications then for investors? Well, obviously, as an investor, if you use the taxonomy for screening or identifying companies, you might limit your investment space quite a lot. So we highly recommend using other lenses as well. A great thing that I've heard is Upright's net impact. That's a good one option to use if you don't want to be missing huge parts of your investment space. And then again, for companies, it is very important for all companies to keep in mind that your climate impact may not be completely captured by using the taxonomy. So if, for example, your investors are using it or some other stakeholders, make sure the best thing to do as a company is maybe not go lobbying outside in Brussels, outside some of the EU offices, but to stay sane and focus on your business. Maybe just make sure you validate your climate impact via other lenses too. So make sure you have something on black and white to explain and validate and prove in a very fact-based way what is your impact on climate change, because the EU taxonomy, even just for the climate change objectives, is not perfect and is not capturing all. Maybe it shouldn't capture all. That's also a great question for discussion, but just something to keep in mind when looking at the actual data. Cool. A second takeaway that we found from the data and that we wanted to share with you guys was when you actually look at the definitions the EU has given for the principal adverse impacts, the PAI indicators, you can see that many of them completely lack value chain consideration. What this means that they simply define it as the internal, for example, water usage or something like that. They don't even try to capture what is happening in the value chain. This can lead to pretty nonsensical conclusions if the PAI indicators are used or taken at face value. And actually, Juho has quite a good example of this. So I don't know, Juho, if you would like to walk us through this example.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, again, I'm just using this example to illustrate this point. You could come up, and there are actual examples. That there are a lot of more examples that I could do, but here is a simplified illustrative example to make the problem as clear as possible. So let's consider Lisa's publishing house. So Lisa's publishing house publishes books, physical ones, and it has these three business functions. That's production, so it is printing the books. Then it has the editorial department, which is discussing with authors and making book deals and so on. And then there's the marketing function, which is marketing and distributing the books. And when you look at certain impacts on the production side, printing uses electricity, which translates into GHG emissions. So illustratively, now Lisa's publishing house has 50 tons of GHG emissions per year. In addition to that, printing also creates hazardous waste. So there are all kinds of residues from printing that are then need to be handled as hazardous waste. When you look at the other functions, editorial and marketing, they are just stuff that you do internally in an office, meaning that you just get some GHG emissions related to the electricity use of your offices and so on. And when you now look at the relevant PAI indicators for Lisa's publishing house, you will have, first of all, GHG emissions, 52 tons, and these are now scope 2 emissions, since this is not created directly in the company, but it is through the electricity use of the company, which goes in scope 2 bucket now for Lisa's publishing house. And then there's the hazardous waste, which comes from the production and the printing side. Moving on, let's consider another company. This is Jim's Print Office. Jim's Print Office is only printing books for others. And it operates a similar scale now as Lisa's publishing house, prints the same amount of books, and also operates in a similar way when it comes to sustainability. So uses the same amount of electricity, which translates to the same amount of GHG emissions, and then also produces the same amount of hazardous waste. And for the PAI indicators here, it's pretty similar, the same 100 kilograms as waste, and also GHG emissions now 50 instead of 52, because you don't have those GHG emissions tons from the editorial marketing side. Moving on. Now we have Czech's publishing house, which is now supplied by Chim's print office. And in this illustrated simple example, we're assuming that Chim's print office is only supplying Czech's publishing house. And it is also printing all books of Czech's publishing house. And Czech's publishing house is not printing any books on their own. So they also only have editorial marketing functions, and again at the same scale as Liszt's publishing house, producing the same amount of GHG emissions, which results in the following PAI indicators for Czech's publishing house. So you will have the GHG emissions, which now you have 2 tons of scope 2 emissions related to electricity use from the editorial marketing. And then if Czech's publishing house, and this is a big if, as we will discuss later on today, if Czech's publishing house actually fully reports their scope 3 GHG emissions, those 50 GHG emission tons would be reported in their scope GHG emissions. So these are the 50 tons that Chim's print office is actually creating. But again, this is usually not the case. Most companies don't fully report their scope 3 GHG emissions, and these are the kind of things that usually are left out. Finally, for hazardous waste, it's simply 0 because the PAI indicator for hazardous waste considers only internal stuff and will not include any of the hazardous waste from the supplier, which in this case is Chim's print office. So when considering these principal adverse impacts, obviously, and you're looking into investing into a publishing house, Czech's publishing house going to look much better than Liszt's, despite there being no actual real world difference in the impact. And of course, when you think of this, the problem here is that this can lead to weird incentives. In this case, there is a strong incentive to outsource your problems or outsource your dirty stuff to someone else, and this is why it's really important to really integrate the whole value chain into any consideration. As a quick note to get maybe back on the same side, if you look at the big picture, here is this is no more illustrative. This is a net impact profile of an actual publishing house called Otava in Finland, and what it looks like is that that you have those small negative impacts on GHG emissions and also waste, but they are outweighed by the positive impacts to distributing knowledge and also meaning and joy, which is also something that we can see in the science, that books are important for people. And of course, in the net impact analysis, the result doesn't depend on whether the printing is outsourced or not. Was there something Annu wanted to add to this?
Yeah, no, this is just one of my favorite rants, as many of you might know, about really looking at the value chain, and not necessarily as a big surprise that the EU is not including it, but this is something that I strongly believe in the next 6 to 24 months, if I would say a bit of a conservative evaluation, the global impact discussion will attack this heavily, because this leads to really nonsensical things like as Juha said, just really weird incentives for cleaning your hands away from there. I just had great discussions with some of the largest players in the mobile gaming industry, discussing about, good luck, we're not in mobile devices, those guys get a lot of emissions. I'm like, come on, your product cannot be used without without basically, a mobile game cannot be played without a mobile device by definition. So this is something that in 2020's impact allocation and impact measuring is simply something we take into account. And all the best forward-looking companies are taking a sort of owner's perspective, as all of you are as well, who are the investors online, to everything they're doing. And this is something we need to it moves in the value chains just as dollars do. So this is something that I believe we're going to get better at. And I really hope the EU is also working on the PAI definitions. But just to be aware that this is now what the PAIs are depending on. We have one question in the chat from Riku Salvinen. I don't know, Riku, if you would like to voice your question yourself or comment on it more. Or
yes, so I was just wondering that in this great example, that how about delivering the books to the store? So the emissions from delivery and logistics, are they counted as well?
Yeah, that's a great point. This was a little bit simplified. So actually, when you have the so-called marketing function, which I mentioned is also doing the distribution, then probably should have some more GHG emissions here. But yeah, this was a kind of a simplified example in this sense. Good point.
Did you, Riku, mean that is it included in the PAI in the definition by the EU, or?
Actually, like this, I was just wondering that if it was meant to be included in the marketing. So yeah.
Yeah. Good point to Juho's.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, in the upright model, we included because we obviously like model the whole value chain and all the linkages between the companies. So obviously the global logistics processes are linked to any kind of physical products or materials moving around. So obviously Ottawa would also be linked. The books don't just magically fly from one place to another, or the paper related to them. So obviously in Ottawa's case, there is a linkage to the global delivery and logistics processes as well. Great point, Riku. Thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, cool. Maybe moving on to our, if there are no more questions, maybe moving on to our third grand insight of the day. So one thing that really we would love all of you as the program participants and the Upright platform users to be aware of is that the taxonomy alignment figures, and of course, now we're talking about alignment, not eligibility. As far as alignment goes, you all know what a problematic and big thing that can be for investors to guess it before companies are really obliged to disclose it, and so on and so on. And you know that we are working on about to publish, Tonika maybe give you later on a more clear timeline, but about to publish very shortly also our own alignment estimates that we've been working on. But basically the alignment figures that companies are working on depend highly on the interpretations that are done within the company or whoever might be looking at the company, be it an investor or whoever. We actually touched them on this topic in one of our earlier sessions during this fall, but we get so many questions and answers that we thought might be a good idea to revisit this point and really spell it out what this means and how this happens in practice. So Juho, as you are, you have a double hat of being the CTO of Upright and also the official storyteller of a crazy illustrated company. So would you like to, Juho, give us an example of this finding number 3?
Yeah, sure. And before going to that, it's good to clarify that there are actually many ways in which the alignment figures highly depend on interpretation. This example is about one particular way on how they depend on the interpretation. And this is particularly about how choices related to how you draw boundaries within activities affects the reported alignment. I'm going to go through this rather quickly because we have discussed this before, but just to remind everyone, if you have a company like this, which is producing aluminum, and it has 4 different products. One of them is this manganese blended aluminum for aerospace applications. And then you have another product, zinc blended aluminum for aerospace applications, manganese blended aluminum for car parts, and zinc blended aluminum for car parts. And all of these different products have a slightly different GHG intensity, as you can see on the slide. And in the EU taxonomy, there is this activity called manufacturing aluminum. And in the EU taxonomy, there is this, for that particular activity, there is this technical screening criteria, which says that the GHG emissions should not exceed more than 1,484 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per ton of aluminum manufactured. And when you then assess the alignment of the company, it will depend on how you draw boundaries within the company when you're kind of aggregating intensities. So if you look at the company as a whole, its aggregate GHG intensity will be 1,630, which is more than 484, meaning that it would be not aligned at all. However, if you make this kind of a split, you just look at zinc blende aluminum for car parts, you will see that, okay, this is now aligned, and you get an alignment of 25. But you could also maybe draw the boundaries like this. So you just consider car parts as a whole. Their aggregate GHG intensity is still less than the threshold. And then, of course, you could do it on the way around, get a little bit larger number, still being below threshold, or even come up with some creative justification for splitting it like this to achieve the maximum number, which is just barely below the threshold. And one important thing about this example is you should not think that, okay, there is some ambiguity, and maybe EU can come up with more specific rules on how to draw these boundaries. Maybe they'll do that, but this problem is actually more fundamental than that. It's kind of baked into the fundamental design of the taxonomy regulation. So you will have this kind of problems no matter how you define the details when you have these kind of thresholds. In this case, 1,484. Which divides the activities into the two sides. So you're kind of losing information. You're thinking of things as black and white, and this as doing this kind of good or bad justification. And yes, the EU can come up maybe with some rules on how you do the splits, and this would maybe make it deterministic on what kind of number you end up with, if we are now ignoring all the other problems with interpretation. But that probably would not be fair for many companies, and would also produce the same kind of nonsensical results that we have with the earlier pi indicator example. So this is something that well, might be a conscious choice to simplify things by the EU when they have been developing this, but this is not something that can be easily fixed. And one thing that I think might be the case, EU has to some extent recognized this, because there are some plans to integrate, instead of having black and white, having some shades there, so that you would have different levels of alignment. So you can be really aligned or a little bit less aligned within activities. But yeah, it's interesting to see how this will develop. Luckily, this is less of a problem for example, activities that are more inherently positive. So if you're doing carbon capture, you're probably going to be aligned in any case. So this is more of a problem for these kind of activities like aluminum manufacturing, where you really need to, where you would actually really need to make a careful net impact analysis and to understand, okay, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And when the EU has been coming up with this number 1,404, they have probably been trying to do some net impact analysis on how much, what is the threshold at which we can consider this aluminum manufacturing good thing or not. But yeah, just adding a little more depth to the discussion from previous session. Is there something on you would like to add?
No, I'm just yeah, well, mainly just echoing your point about the this really, because many times when we show examples like this, hey, okay, just bear in mind that whatever you hear from Jim's aluminum company, it might have a heavy factor on how they have decided to do the groupings, as you have just showed. And then, okay, then the way to fix that is that maybe the EU will make better definitions. And this is something pretty fundamental to understand about the nature of the taxonomy. So when there is a taxonomy that is basically dividing, in a way, companies into two, so you're either aligned or not, it's a binary thing. I don't want to say good versus bad companies, but in a way it is a bit of a black and white world where you just basically decide which are doing good and which are not. You create a little bit of a fun incentive. And then, at least for me, I feel a bit frustrated seeing humanity spending a lot of time and real adults in suits drawing boxes like this to try to like treat the numbers look better. It changes nothing in the real world, and the value created is at least questionable. Anyways, the way to fix that is also not necessarily to just wait for the EU to as you have said, they could, of course, and maybe they will make more detailed and tell exactly how you should be slicing this and that. But in the end of the day, it is really in the main idea of doing this kind of a binary or dichotomy of products where the problem lies. And that's why we heavily believe where the scene will be moving is not so much towards kind of like the taxonomy is the first step, just understanding what the products are, but then you should be really measuring inside there the holistic impact and creating sensible impacts for companies to all the time improve on their net impact, basically what you get done with what the resources you are using. So in this case, for this company to continuously improve their efficiency of using the natural resources while getting the maximum tons of aluminum done, if that is essentially the value that is being spit out of the process. Good, but maybe that's that for this example. For a final takeaway for this little insight session is then around scopes. So scopes 1, 2, and 3. We've been discussing them quite a bit during this autumn for a good reason. Greenhouse gas emissions are the most discussed over, and for a good reason, individual impact, both within the EU data, net impact data, wherever you might be looking at. And as we all know, we have the scope 1, 2, and 3. And we all know that the scope 3 is what really seals the deal, but it is being very poorly documented. And this is just something to keep in mind. And we wanted to look at real data. So there's a lot of like, yeah, scope 3 really matters. We wanted to really look, because we've been going through thousands of companies during this really granularly during this autumn in the whole team here, and with some help from outside as well. So just to give you one example of one batch analysis, to be very concrete. So we looked at one particular batch of 717 companies. This is now one of the many analyses we did. And all the companies, and these were now all companies that were disclosing some kind of greenhouse gas emissions. As we all know from these discussions and a lot of our work from before, this is only, of course, a small fraction of all companies that are out there, because majority of them, especially for many of you coming from private equity or venture capital, or just being an unlisted company yourself, a lot of this reporting or disclosing doesn't exist. Okay, so these are now 770 companies who are in the minority of actually disclosing some GHG emissions. Of these companies, a mere 19% are actually disclosing their full scope 3 GHG emissions. We've been discussing this in previous sessions, what actually goes in scope 3 and how there it is actually pretty rare to capture the largest and most significant chunks. And it's typical to just touch upon some of the so-called easy parts. So to be completely true to the data, 66% disclosed some scope 3 emissions, but most of them only included a couple of easy picks, like, hey, our CEO made only 3 flights last year because of the pandemic or something like that. So just having some really, really easy, and typically depending a little bit on the business, but typically a very small item would be something like business travel for an individual company. Why is this a problem then? Only 19% of those that even disclose GHG emissions give a full picture of the scope 3. Is that sometimes just the existence of data might create you a false sense of security that, okay, so then it's dealt with, it's reported, it's there. When you should really understand that scope 3 represents a whopping majority of the emissions, as many of you know. And once again, not just saying that, hey, it's a lot. We know companies where it's more than 97%. We've been going through some examples here as well. We all then also know that that's not the case for every one of them. So we calculated a very conservative analysis on this and looked for the median proportion of Scope 3 emissions of the whole GHG emissions, and it's 85%. That was the medium figure. So this is just to bear in mind that Scope 3, if you don't understand Scope 3, you haven't really understood GHG at all. And it might be even a bit misleading or have a sort of a wrong kind of, if I, for example, as the CEO of Upright, were like, hey, I just checked our like electricity bill for the office and it's gone down by 5% or something like that. Obviously, I'm not capturing anything that we as a company can be, could be, or are doing for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really important to not just look at the accuracy of data, but really be honest and fact-based about what the data is capturing, and be honest about where we stand today globally in terms of disclosing GHG Scope 3 emissions. What to do about this? Once again, I have a great suggestion for you. You can use Upright's model, where we also have done a lot of crazy analysis with regression and other tools to utilize all the companies that have done this properly, have done a full definition of Scope 3 and created estimates using the similar value chains and supply chains that the companies are included in and the downstream effects that they're included in, to produce the figures also for the ones we're missing. We've seen this in funny ways during this autumn, that we thought that the coolest thing that people would like to see is the real data, so the actual disclosures by companies, but actually we've seen more interest in the modeled estimates that are then of the full scope than of the individual teeny tiny fractions that are being reported. Once again, just a reminder of where the big chunks lie.